Hi, my name is Dr. Brenda Hannon. I'm from Texas A&M University in Kingsville, and today I'd like to tell you about my research about the early developmental patterns of skilled and less skilled readers' performances on the component skills of reading comprehension. Good reading comprehension is essential for academic and economic success. Thus, it's not that surprising that numerous studies have examined the influences that multiple component skills have on reading comprehension. Some skills, such as word decoding, vocabulary, and grammar, are considered to be lower level because they are foundational or essential for the comprehension of complex discourse. Other skills, such as knowledge integration, are considered to be higher level because they are used to construct a coherent, meaning-based text representation based on information retrieved from both the text and a reader's long-term memory. However, whether the developmental patterns of these component skills are equivalent from component skill to component skill, or between children with poorer skills versus good skills, is highly controversial. Some researchers argue that children do not differ in their developmental paces of reading and its component skills. According to this view, all children require and develop reading comprehension ability and its component skills at the same pace, regardless of their initial skill level. And equivalent growth is often labeled as a stable developmental pattern. And here you can see in the graph below that the difference between the skilled, which are dark, and less skilled, which are dashed, it's the same at time 1 and time 2. So steady increase. Developmental pace is the same. Other researchers, however, argue that children vary in both their acquisition and development of reading comprehension and its component skills, and these differences manifest in one of two ways. One group of researchers argue that children who fail to acquire reading and its component skills early catch up to their more skilled counterparts, possibly as a consequence of systematic reading instruction in the earlier grades. This narrowing of the achievement gap is often called a compensatory or developmental lag developmental pattern. So here at time point 1, you have a large gap between skilled and less skilled readers, but at time point 2, the gap is narrowing. Still, other researchers argue for the opposite pattern of development, where children with better reading skills develop their skills more quickly than children with poor reading skills. Okay, presumably they acquire reading and its component skills early, and because they enjoy reading, they therefore read more frequently. Okay, on the other hand, children who fail to acquire reading don't like reading, so therefore they don't read. And this effect is called the fan spread effect, or better known as the Matthew effect. And here you have at time point 1, where the skilled and less skilled readers are closer in their gap, and then at time point 2, the gap has got bigger. This lack of consensus among researchers about the developmental patterns of the component skills of reading may be the result of several issues. One issue is the age of the children during the initial assessment. With the exception of a few studies targeting preschoolers, most studies examining developmental patterns have targeted children who are already reading. However, many component skills begin developing well before a child begins to read. The second is how little research there is. With the exception of a few studies, most studies examining the developmental patterns of reading comprehension and its components have examined just reading comprehension. And finally, the demographics of the children being investigated. There's little to no research examining gender differences, ethnicity, or social economic status. Therefore, the goals of the present study are to identify the early developmental patterns of multiple component skills of reading while addressing the aforementioned issues. By starting with children who have limited reading abilities at time point 1 and by assessing important component skills. In order to achieve these goals, children's listening comprehension, working memory capacity, vocabularies, and lower and higher level component skills were assessed in kindergarten, which is time point 1, and again 2 years later at time point 2. Now we need to talk about the component skills of reading. Most researchers agree that we form a coherent mental representation, But representations are not in isolation. They require the coordination and execution of multiple lower and higher level component skills, regardless of the age of the reader. Accordingly, lower level word skills decode letters on a page and identify word meanings. Higher level text memory, literal and inferential processes extract ideas from a text, while knowledge integration processes integrate explicit and implicit text-based information with information from a reader's long-term memory. All these component skills are also included in theories of reading comprehension. For example, the simple view of reading argues that reading is a product of word decoding and comprehension skills. The verbal efficiency theory, here word decoding skills are important in as much as slow and inefficient word decoding skills are believed to consume limited working memory resources, which are necessary for executing higher level comprehension skills such as inferencing and knowledge integration. Moreover, some researchers have gone as far to suggest that word decoding must be adequate before comprehension strategies can be utilized during reading comprehension. Despite these advances in understanding the powers of the preschooler component skills to predict future listening and reading comprehension, we don't know the developmental patterns. And this lack of knowledge is problematic because how can we help teachers develop exercises for improving the component skills of reading when we don't know what the developmental patterns are? Just more on the developmental patterns. Reading comprehension development, again, varies between poor and good readers, and these variations can be categorized in three broad developmental patterns: stable, compensatory, and the fan spread effect. Of these three developmental patterns, the fan spread effect or the Matthew effect has attracted the bulk of the attention. In stable developmental patterns, the difference between skilled and less skilled children's scores are constant over time. One group neither increases or decreases. Okay. In compensatory developmental patterns, the difference between skilled and less skilled children's scores decrease over time, and this is sometimes described as narrowing the achievement gap. In the fan spread effect, here we have the opposite. We have the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. Research examining the developmental patterns for reading comprehension component skills for preschool to grade 9 children report varying results. When just those studies using kinder as a baseline in a meta-analysis were analyzed separately, the results revealed disparate results for a composite measure of reading proficiency. For example, 2 of the 5 studies had fan spread effects. 1 of them had a compensative developmental pattern, 1 had a stable, and 1 of them was dependent on whether the population was learning disabled or normal. So the fact that multiple component skills are highly predictive of beginning reading and listening comprehension raises the important question about the developmental patterns of the component skills. What are these? Okay, so the major goal of this study is to identify these developmental patterns of multiple component skills, starting with young children in kinder and then retesting them 2 years later. As just mentioned, all our children were kindergarten children. They had the typical age you'd expect in kinder and the typical age that you'd expect in grade 2 when they were tested 2 years later. All were English speakers who at best spoke or understood only a few words in another language. There were measures administered at time point 1, and they were all administered individually. Time point 2, some of the measures like listening comprehension and reading were in small groups of 2 or 3. Other measures like word identification, etc. were administered individually. Just briefly, we had 2 standardized measures of listening and comprehension, 1 at each time point. So 1 in kinder, 1 in grade 2, and both were the Iowa. They were age-appropriate Iowa. Reading comprehension was administered at time point 2. This was the Gates-McGinty. For knowledge integration skills, children either heard, which was the kinder, or read, which is the grade 2, these short stories that consisted of nonsense words like mert and cough and real words like ostrich and robin, and then answered true false statements. For example, does a mert have a longer neck than a crow? The working memory measure was an auditory working memory measure. Vocabulary, we used the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, a very common vocabulary test. Form A was used on the kinders, Form B for the grade 2s. Word decoding, this was the Woodcock Reading Mastery Test. It was administered at both time points. The letter word identification measured, children read the letters and words out loud, MN, dog, photograph, etc. For the phonologic coding, they sounded out the letters like pseudo words K, tif, zoop. It got progressively difficult. Now, it's important that you understand the logic of our analysis. We completed analysis of variance for each of the components of rating and looked at the results. And with respect to developmental patterns, the presence of a significant main effect for skill level between skilled and less skilled children, but a non-significant time point by skill level interaction is evidence of stable developmental patterns. Again, just to remind you what it looks like, here's the picture below. You can see there's no interaction here. It's just a steady main effect of skill where the skilled children had higher scores consistently at time point 1 and 2. For compensatory developmental pattern here, though, we're looking for a time point by skill interaction such that the gap at time point 1 is larger than the gap at time point 2. For the fan spread effect, we're looking for just the opposite type of interaction, a smaller gap at time point 1, a larger gap at time point 2. What we found was the time point by skill interaction was significant for 5 of the component skills. So for letter word decoding, here we had a compensatory developmental pattern. We had a compensatory developmental pattern for listening comprehension, compensatory developmental pattern for knowledge integration, compensatory developmental pattern for vocabulary knowledge, compensatory developmental pattern for working memory. However, for phonological decoding, we did not have a compensatory developmental pattern. We actually had a stable developmental pattern. So we also examined the influences of says and running age, and we did analysis of covariance that covariated out says and running age, 2 separate analysis covariants, and we found there was no effect of socioeconomic status on the developmental patterns and no effect of running age. So whether the child was a young kinder or an old kinder or a young grade 2 and old grade 2, it didn't impact the developmental pattern. There was also no developmental, no influence for gender, and there was also no influence for ethnicity. So our conclusions, the results revealed compensatory developmental patterns for letter word identification, listening comprehension, knowledge integration, vocabulary, working memory, and a stable developmental pattern for phonological decoding. And these patterns persisted even when the influences of social economic status, running age, gender, and ethnicity were considered. Why did we see all these compensatory developmental patterns? Well, perhaps, for example, systematic reading instruction in the early grades is more beneficial to children who start with less developed component skills than it is for children who start with more developed skills. This explanation is certainly consistent with the present findings, okay? And the fact that there's no influence of socioeconomic status, running age, gender, or ethnicity. The present findings are both theoretically and practically important. Theoretically, most theories of reading do not distinguish whether differences between less skilled and skilled readers are a result of differences in baseline performances, that is their performance at time point 1, or differences in gains between time point 1 and 2, or a combination of these two possibilities. Practically, determining the developmental patterns is important because when one group of students makes smaller gains than another, Such patterns underscore not only the need of regular assessment, but also the need for customized instruction for groups of children who are making smaller than expected gains on a component skill. And thank you.